Good evening. Picture this. You're told that you will one day kill your father and marry your mother. You're informed that your greatest glory will come at the cost of your life. You're granted the divine gift of seeing the future, only to discover that no one will ever believe your warnings. These aren't nightmares. These are prophecies, the supposed blessings of the gods in ancient Greece. But here's the twisted truth that the myths don't want you to realize. Greek prophecies were never meant to save anyone. They were elaborate traps, cosmic curses disguised as divine wisdom, designed to ensure that the very act of trying to escape your fate would guarantee its fulfillment. Tonight, we descend into the darkest corners of Greek mythology to uncover why prophecies in the ancient world were essentially death sentences wrapped in riddles. We'll explore how the gods weaponized the future against mortals, turning knowledge into torment and destiny into damnation. From the tragic downfall of Oedipus to the ignored warnings of Cassandra. From the inevitable doom of Achilles to the manipulative riddles of the oracle at Delphi, we'll discover that in the Greek cosmos, knowing your fate was the cruelest punishment of all. Before we dive into this twisted world of divine manipulation and mortal suffering, tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching this from and what time it is. Are you watching from the ruins of ancient temples under moonlight, or perhaps from a modern city as dawn breaks? And if you're drawn to the dark mysteries that shaped our civilization, make sure to subscribe, because we're about to embark on a journey through the most cursed stories ever told, and trust me, this is just the beginning of an odyssey you won't want to miss. To understand why Greek prophecies were curses, we must first understand the very architecture of the Greek cosmos. This wasn't a universe governed by hope or redemption. This was a reality where the Fates, three ancient sisters named Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos, literally wove the destiny of every living being into an unbreakable tapestry. Clotho spun the thread of life, Lachesis measured its length, and Atropos cut it with her shears. Even Zeus, the king of the gods, could not alter what the fates had decreed. In this cosmic framework, prophecies weren't predictions, they were announcements. They weren't warnings that might help you change course. They were notifications of what had already been decided in the halls of eternity. The gods who delivered these prophecies weren't being helpful, they were being cruel. They were giving mortals just enough knowledge to understand their doom, but never enough power to prevent it. Think about the psychological torture this represents. Imagine being told exactly how your life will end, exactly what mistakes you'll make, exactly what horrors await you, but being utterly powerless to change any of it. This is the Greek concept of fate, and it's far more terrifying than any monster or war. It's the ultimate expression of cosmic helplessness. The Greeks had a word for this, moira, meaning portion or lot. Your moira was your allocated share of existence, predetermined before your birth, unchangeable despite your struggles. Prophecies simply revealed portions of this moira, usually the most tragic portions, creating a psychological prison where the bars were made of knowledge itself. But here's where it gets even more insidious. The gods didn't just passively observe these fates, they actively engineered situations to ensure prophecies came true. They would plant the seeds of their own predictions, creating self-fulfilling prophecies that trapped mortals in webs of their own desperate attempts to escape. This brings us to our first, and perhaps most devastating example of prophetic cruelty. The story of a king whose attempts to save his son would doom an entire city. Long before Oedipus became a household name for tragedy, there was his father, King Laius of Thebes. Laius received what might be the most straightforward prophecy in all symbol of Greek mythology. Your son will kill you and bring ruin to your kingdom. No riddles, no ambiguity, just a clear and terrifying statement of future fact. Now, any reasonable person hearing this might think, well, I simply won't have a son. And that's exactly what Laius tried to do. He avoided his wife, Jocasta, desperately, attempting to prevent the birth that would lead to his death. But the gods had other plans. One night, influenced by wine and divine manipulation, Laius slept with his wife, and she conceived. When the child was born, Laius took what he believed was decisive action. He pierced the infant's feet with iron pins, binding them together, and gave the baby to a shepherd with orders to leave him on Mount Cithaeron to die. The name they gave this doomed child was Oedipus, meaning swollen foot, a name that would forever mark him as the one who was meant to die but lived. But here's the cruel irony. The prophecy had built into its very structure the act of trying to prevent it guaranteed its fulfillment. The shepherd, moved by pity, couldn't bring himself to let the infant die. Instead, he gave the child to another shepherd from Corinth, who presented the baby to the childless king Polybus and Queen Merope. They adopted Oedipus as their own son, never telling him the truth of his origins. The prophecy had set its trap perfectly by trying to kill his son. Laius had ensured that Oedipus would grow up not knowing his true parentage. This ignorance would be the key that unlocked the very fate Laius had tried to prevent. Every step taken to avoid the prophecy was actually a step toward its fulfillment. Years later, when Oedipus was a young man in Corinth, he would hear rumors about his parentage. Troubled by these whispers, he would travel to Delphi to consult the oracle, setting in motion the events that would fulfill the prophecy down to its last horrible detail. The gods had played a game of cosmic chess, and every move the mortals made had been anticipated and incorporated into their inevitable defeat. This is the fundamental nature of Greek prophetic curses. They don't just predict tragedy, they engineer it. They create the very conditions that make the tragedy unavoidable, then sit back and watch mortals dance to the tune of their own destruction. Let's follow young Oedipus as he leaves Corinth, believing he's fleeing from his fate, but actually walking directly into it. When he consults the oracle at Delphi, hoping to learn the truth about his parentage, he receives instead a prophecy that chills his blood. You will kill your father and marry your mother. Horrified by this prediction and believing Polybus and Merope to be his true parents, Oedipus makes what seems like the logical choice. He vows never to return to Corinth. He will wander the world rather than risk harming the people he loves. It's a noble decision, the choice of a hero who would sacrifice his own happiness to protect others. And it's exactly what the prophecy needed him to do. As Oedipus travels away from Corinth, he encounters an older man in a chariot at a crossroads where three paths meet. The man is imperious and demanding, ordering Oedipus to get out of the way. Hot-tempered and proud, Oedipus refuses. A fight breaks out, and in the scuffle, Oedipus kills the older man and his servants, save one who flees. The man he has killed is Laius, his true father. The first part of the prophecy has been fulfilled, and Oedipus doesn't even know it. The crossroads where this happens will become a symbol in literature for moments where fate intervenes in human choice, where free will becomes an illusion and destiny takes control. Continuing his journey, Oedipus arrives at Thebes to find the city in the grip of terror. The Sphinx, a monster with the body of a lion, the wings of an eagle, and the head of a woman, has been devouring anyone who cannot answer her riddle. The regent Creon has promised the throne and the hand of the recently widowed Queen Jocasta. To anyone who can defeat the creature, the Sphinx poses her famous riddle. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening? Oedipus, clever and determined, provides the correct answer. Man, who crawls as a baby, walks upright in his prime, and uses a cane in old age. The Sphinx, defeated by his wisdom, hurls herself from her cliff and dies. Oedipus is hailed as the savior of Thebes. He marries Jocasta and becomes king, believing he has achieved a happy ending through his own intelligence and courage. He has no idea that he has just married his mother, completing the second half of the prophecy for years. Oedipus rules wisely and well. He and Jocasta have 4 children: Iticles, Polynices, Antigone, and Ismene. He believes he has escaped his fate through clever choices and decisive action. But the prophecy is simply waiting for the right moment to reveal its full horror. That moment comes when a plague strikes Thebes. The oracle declares that the plague will only end when the murderer of Laius is found and punished. Oedipus, the conscientious king, vows to discover the killer and bring him to justice. He has no idea that he is hunting himself. The investigation that follows is a masterpiece of dramatic irony. Every clue Oedipus uncovers points toward him. Every witness he questions reveals another piece of the truth he doesn't want to see. The sole surviving servant from Laius's retinue is brought forward, and reluctantly confirms that the man who killed the king was a single warrior at a crossroads, matching Oedipus's description perfectly. When the full truth finally emerges, the revelation destroys everyone it touches. Jocasta, realizing she has been married to her own son and borne his children, hangs herself in their marriage chamber. Oedipus, confronted with the ultimate horror of his existence, takes the golden brooches from her dress and drives them into his own eyes, blinding himself as he screams, "You will never see again the horrors I have suffered and caused." The prophecy has achieved something far more devastating than simple death. It has created a living hell where a good man discovers he is the source of his own city's suffering, where a loving son has unknowingly destroyed his parents, where a devoted husband learns his wife was his mother. The knowledge that was supposed to save him has instead revealed that his entire life was built on an unspeakable foundation of cosmic horror. This is the true cruelty of Greek prophecies. They don't just predict tragedy, they ensure that the victim participates in their own destruction. Oedipus's intelligence, his courage, his sense of justice, all the qualities that made him a hero, were weaponized against him by fate itself. If Oedipus represents the horror of fulfilling prophecy despite your best efforts to avoid it, then Cassandra represents something even more psychologically torturous. The agony of seeing disaster coming and being powerless to prevent it because no one will believe your warnings. Cassandra was a Trojan princess, daughter of King Priam and Queen Hecuba, renowned for her beauty and wisdom. Her curse began as what appeared to be a blessing. Apollo, the god of prophecy, music, and the sun, fell in love with her and offered her the gift of prophecy in exchange for her love. Cassandra accepted the gift, but then, at the last moment, rejected Apollo's advances. Now, most gods would simply take back their gift, but Apollo was far more creative in his cruelty. He couldn't revoke the prophetic power he had already granted, but he could corrupt it with a kiss that seemed tender but was actually malevolent. Apollo cursed Cassandra so that while she would always see the truth of the future, no one would ever believe her prophecies. Imagine the psychological torture this represents. Cassandra could see every disaster, every death, every tragedy approaching Troy and its people. But when she tried to warn them, they dismissed her as mad, hysterical, or simply mistaken. She became known as a madwoman, her desperate attempts to save her people interpreted as ravings and delusions. When Paris brought Helen to Troy, Cassandra saw the 10-year war that would follow, the death of her brothers, the destruction of her city, and the enslavement of her people. She begged her family not to welcome Helen, but they ignored her. When the Trojans debated whether to accept the wooden horse left by the Greeks, Cassandra screamed warnings about the soldiers hidden inside, but her people celebrated what they believed was a victory gift. The night Troy fell, Cassandra took refuge in the temple of Athena, clinging to the goddess's statue as the Greek warriors poured through the city. But even sacred sanctuary couldn't protect her. Ajax, the lesser, dragged her from the altar and violated her, an act of sacrilege that would later bring divine punishment upon the Greek fleet. Yet even in that moment of ultimate horror, Cassandra could see future events unfolding. The storms that would scatter the Greek ships, the long, difficult journeys home, the deaths that awaited the victors. After Troy's fall, Cassandra was claimed as a prize by Agamemnon, the Greek king who had led the siege. As his ship sailed toward Mycenae, Cassandra could see what awaited them. Agamemnon's wife, Clytemnestra, had taken a lover, Aegisthus, and together they planned to murder the returning king. Cassandra saw the net that would entangle Agamemnon in his bath, the axe that would end his life, and her own death that would follow moments later. When they arrived at Mycenae, Cassandra refused to enter the palace, standing before its doors, and speaking of the blood she could smell within its walls, the screams of past murders that echoed in its halls. The chorus of Argive elders who witnessed this scene describes her as speaking things too dark to understand. Her prophecies dismissed once again as the ravings of a foreign slave. Woman, Clytemnestra, emerged from the palace and mockingly invited Cassandra inside, saying that even slaves must accept their fate. Cassandra finally entered, knowing exactly what would happen next, seeing her own death as clearly as if it had already occurred. Moments later, the screams from within confirmed everything she had foreseen. The tragedy of Cassandra isn't just that she died, it's that she spent her entire life watching disasters approach that she could have prevented if anyone had listened to her. Her curse made her a prisoner of knowledge, forced to witness the suffering of everyone she cared about while being branded as insane for trying to help them. Apollo's curse created the perfect psychological torture device, a prophet whose accuracy was perfect but whose credibility was non-existent. Every true vision became a source of fresh agony as Cassandra realized that her knowledge was useless, that she was doomed to watch tragedy unfold in slow motion while being unable to stop it. This is perhaps the most refined form of prophetic cruelty in Greek mythology. It's not enough to trap someone in fate. You must also make them complicit in their own helplessness by giving them knowledge they cannot use and wisdom no one will accept. Not all Greek prophecies promised only disaster. Some offered choices, presenting mortals with options that seemed to provide agency and control over their destinies. But as the story of Achilles demonstrates, even prophecies that appear to offer freedom are often just more sophisticated forms of entrapment. Achilles was born to the sea-nymph Thetis and the mortal King Peleus. From his birth, it was prophesied that he would face a choice that no hero had ever faced before. He could live a long, peaceful life in obscurity, or he could achieve immortal glory at the cost of dying young in battle. The prophecy seemed generous, offering genuine alternatives rather than inevitable doom. Thetis, knowing what lay ahead for her son, tried desperately to protect him from his fate. She attempted to make him immortal by dipping him in the river Styx, holding him by his heel as the divine waters washed over his body. Every part of him became invulnerable except for that small spot where her fingers had gripped him, the spot that would later give us the phrase Achilles' heel. When the Trojan War began and the Greek heroes gathered to sail for Troy, Thetis knew that if Achilles joined the expedition, he would choose glory over life. To prevent this, she disguised him as a girl and hid him among the daughters of King Lycomedes on the island of Cyrus. For a time, it seemed as though she had successfully cheated fate, but the Greeks had their own prophecy. Troy could not be taken without Achilles. The clever Odysseus was sent to find the hidden hero. Disguising himself as a merchant, Odysseus spread jewelry and fine cloth before the young women of the court. But hidden among the feminine goods, he placed a sword and shield. When a horn sounded as if announcing an attack, Achilles instinctively grabbed the weapons, revealing his true nature and identity. Confronted with his destiny, Achilles made the choice the prophecy had predicted he would make. He chose glory over longevity, honor over safety, immortal fame over a forgotten, peaceful life. It seemed like a heroic decision, the kind of choice that defines legendary figures throughout history. But was it really a choice at all? The prophecy had shaped every aspect of Achilles' upbringing and character. His divine parentage gave him abilities that made him nearly invincible in battle. His education under the centaur Chiron emphasized honor, courage, and martial excellence. His very nature as a hero meant that when presented with the option of a glorious death or an obscure life, there was really only one choice he could make. The gods had crafted Achilles to be incapable of choosing the quiet life. They had given him strength that demanded expression, pride that required recognition, and a warrior's heart that could only find fulfillment in battle. The prophecy wasn't offering him a genuine choice. It was revealing the illusion of choice while ensuring that his character would inevitably lead him toward glory and death at Troy. Achilles became the most feared warrior on the battlefield, his presence capable of turning the tide of entire battles. But his greatest triumph came at a terrible cost, when his beloved companion, Patroclus, was killed by the Trojan prince Hector. Achilles' grief and rage transformed him into something almost inhuman in his fury. The scene where Achilles drags Hector's body around the walls of Troy, refusing to allow proper burial rites, shows us a hero who has been consumed by the very qualities that made him great. The prophecy hadn't just predicted his choice. It had engineered a personality that would make that choice inevitable and then be destroyed by its consequences. Achilles' death, when it finally came, arrived exactly as prophesied. Paris, guided by Apollo, shot an arrow that found the one vulnerable spot on the hero's body, his heel. The irony was perfect, the very place his mother had held him, while trying to make him immortal became the point through which mortality claimed him. The prophecy of choice given to Achilles reveals perhaps the most sophisticated form of divine manipulation in Greek mythology. Rather than forcing a fate upon him, the gods created conditions where his own nature would choose that fate. They made him into someone who could only find meaning in the very path that would destroy him, then presented this self-destruction as heroic choice. This is the ultimate cruelty of the Achilles prophecy. It convinces its victim that they are freely choosing their doom, while actually making any other choice psychologically impossible at the heart of all. Greek prophecy stood the oracle at Delphi, the most sacred and feared prophetic site in the ancient world, built on the slopes of Mount Parnassus. The temple of Apollo at Delphi was where kings and commoners alike came seeking knowledge of the future. But the oracle wasn't just a source of prophecy. It was a carefully orchestrated system designed to ensure that no one could escape the web of fate. The oracle's power rested in the hands of the Pythia, a priestess who served as Apollo's mouthpiece, seated on a tripod over a chasm in the earth. Breathing vapors that rose from the depths, the Pythia would enter a trance state and speak the god's will. Her words were often cryptic, delivered in riddles and metaphors that required interpretation by the temple priests. This system of cryptic prophecy wasn't an accident or a side effect of divine communication. It was a deliberate design that made the prophecies simultaneously irrefutable and inescapable. By speaking in riddles, the oracle created predictions that could be interpreted multiple ways, ensuring that no matter what actions someone took, they could be seen as fulfilling the prophecy. Consider the famous prophecy given to Croesus, the wealthy king of Lydia, when he consulted the oracle about whether he should attack the Persian Empire. He was told, "If you cross the river, you will destroy a great army." Croesus interpreted this as a promise of victory and launched his invasion. He did indeed destroy a great army, but it was his own. The prophecy was technically accurate while being completely misleading. This is the genius of Delphic prophecy. It creates the illusion of divine guidance, while actually ensuring that the seeker will fulfill the prediction regardless of their interpretation. The ambiguity isn't a flaw, it's the entire point. It makes the prophecy unfalsifiable, and therefore always true, while giving the gods maximum flexibility in how events unfold. The physical setup of the oracle itself was designed to enhance this psychological manipulation. Pilgrims would travel for weeks or months to reach Delphi, building anticipation and investment in the process. They would undergo purification rituals, make expensive offerings, and wait in long lines for their turn to consult the Pythia. By the time they received their prophecy, they were psychologically primed to believe in its importance and truth. The temple priests, who interpreted the Pythia's utterances, were skilled in reading people, understanding politics, and crafting ambiguous statements that could apply to multiple situations. They had networks of informants throughout the Greek world, giving them knowledge of current events that could inform their interpretations. The oracle's reputation for accuracy was built not on supernatural insight, but on careful intelligence, gathering, and clever wordplay. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of Delphic prophecy was how it created self-perpetuating cycles of belief. When a prophecy appeared to come true, it enhanced the oracle's reputation and convinced more people to seek its guidance. When a prophecy seemed to fail, it could always be reinterpreted to show that the seeker had misunderstood the god's message. The system was designed to be unfalsifiable, always right in retrospect, never wrong in a way that could damage its credibility. The psychological effect on those who received prophecies was devastating. They would leave Delphi with knowledge that felt simultaneously precious and terrible, armed with information about their future that they couldn't ignore but couldn't fully understand. Many, like Oedipus, would spend their lives trying to interpret and avoid their prophecies, only to discover that their very efforts to escape had ensured their fulfillment. The oracle at Delphi represents the institutionalization of prophetic cruelty. It was a machine designed to create victims of fate, a system that turned divine knowledge into psychological torture. Its priests were the architects of despair, crafting riddles that that trapped souls in webs of their own making. The motto, inscribed at Delphi, "Know thyself," takes on a sinister meaning in this context. It's not an invitation to self-discovery, but a warning. The knowledge you seek about yourself and your future will be the instrument of your destruction. One of the most terrifying aspects of Greek prophetic curses was their tendency to span generations, creating bloodlines doomed to repeat cycles of violence and tragedy. These weren't individual punishments, but hereditary nightmares that trapped entire family lines in patterns of destruction that could last for centuries. The House of Atreus provides the most infamous example of this multi-generational prophetic horror. The curse began with Tantalus, a king who was welcome to dine with the gods, but betrayed their hospitality in the most horrific way imaginable. To test their omniscience, he killed his own son, Pelops, cooked his flesh, and served it to the gods. As food, the gods immediately recognized the abomination and restored Pelops to life, but the damage was done. Tantalus was condemned to eternal torment in the underworld, forever reaching for fruit that would retreat from his grasp and water that would recede when he tried to drink. More importantly for our story, his crime established a curse that would plague his bloodline for generations. Pelops, despite being restored to life, carried the stain of his father's crime. His own sons, Atreus and Thyestes, would continue the family tradition of fraternal violence and cannibalistic revenge. When Thyestes seduced Atreus's wife, Atreus responded by killing Thyestes' children and serving them to their father at a feast, echoing their grandfather's original sin. This act of revenge triggered a prophecy that would haunt the next generation. Thyestes was told that his revenge could only be achieved through a son born of incest with his own daughter. The resulting child Aegisthus would indeed grow up to murder Atreus and seduce Clytemnestra, Agamemnon's wife, setting in motion the events that would destroy the next generation. Agamemnon, son of Atreus, inherited not just his father's throne, but his family's curse. When the Greek fleet was becalmed at Aulis on their way to Troy, the prophet Calchas revealed that the gods demanded a sacrifice. Agamemnon must kill his own daughter Iphigenia to appease Artemis and allow the winds to blow. Faced with this impossible choice, Agamemnon chose duty over fatherhood, luring Iphigenia to Aulis with the promise that she would marry Achilles, then sacrificing her on the altar. The act that allowed the Trojan War to begin also ensured Agamemnon's own destruction, as Clytemnestra would never forgive the murder of their daughter. The prophecy had created a perfect trap. Agamemnon could either abandon the war effort and face disgrace, or sacrifice his daughter and ensure his wife would become his enemy. Either choice led to his destruction, but only one allowed the war to proceed as the gods had planned. When Agamemnon returned from Troy 10 years later, Clytemnestra was waiting with Aegisthus and a plan for revenge. They killed Agamemnon in his bath, fulfilling both the curse on the house of Atreus and Cassandra's ignored prophecy. But the cycle of violence was far from over. Orestes, Agamemnon's son, received his own prophecy from Apollo. He must avenge his father by killing his mother or face divine punishment. But other powers declared that matricide was the most heinous of crimes and would bring its own curse. Orestes was trapped between competing divine commands, forced to choose between different forms of damnation. When Orestes finally killed Clytemnestra and Aegisthus, he was immediately pursued by the Furies, ancient goddesses of vengeance, who drove him to madness for the crime of matricide. The prophecy had created a situation where obedience to the gods required an act that other gods would punish. ensuring that no choice could lead to peace. The curse on the house of Atreus reveals how Greek prophecies worked across generations, creating patterns of violence that seemed inescapable. Each generation's attempts to break free from the curse only served to pass it on to their children in new and more terrible forms. The gods had created a machine of perpetual tragedy, powered by the very human desires for justice, revenge, and family loyalty. These multi-generational curses served a specific psychological function in Greek mythology. They demonstrated that no individual could escape the consequences of divine displeasure through their own virtue or wisdom. The sins of the fathers would be visited upon the children, not because the children deserved punishment, but because the cosmos itself was structured to ensure that certain bloodlines would serve as eternal examples of divine power. The most terrifying aspect of these hereditary curses was their inevitability. Children born into cursed bloodlines had no choice in their fate. They inherited doom along with their names. They could be virtuous, wise, and heroic, but none of these qualities would save them from the destiny written in their blood. Behind every prophetic curse in Greek mythology lay the complex politics of Olympus, where gods played elaborate games using mortal lives as pieces on a cosmic board. These weren't arbitrary acts of cruelty, but calculated moves in divine power. Struggles that treated human suffering as acceptable collateral damage. The Trojan War itself began as a contest between goddesses, when Eris, the goddess of discord, threw a golden apple inscribed for the fairest among the wedding guests at the marriage of Peleus and Thetis. She triggered a vanity competition between Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. Unable to decide between them, Zeus appointed Paris, a Trojan prince, as judge. Each goddess offered Paris a bribe. Hera promised political power, Athena offered wisdom and military victory, and Aphrodite pledged the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris chose Aphrodite's offer, not realizing that the most beautiful woman was Helen, already married to Menelaus of Sparta. This divine beauty contest wasn't just about vanity. It was about establishing hierarchies of power and influence among the gods. The prophecy that followed, predicting 10 years of war and the destruction of Troy, was essentially a divine contract ensuring that the gods' competition would be played out through human bloodshed. The gods chose sides in the coming war based not on justice or morality, but on their personal relationships and political calculations. Hera and Athena, insulted by Paris's choice, supported the Greeks. Aphrodite and Apollo backed the Trojans. Poseidon shifted his allegiance based on perceived slights and opportunities for revenge. Throughout the war, the gods manipulated events to serve their own purposes, often in direct contradiction to what would benefit their supposed favorites. When Achilles was on the verge of storming Troy and ending the war quickly, the gods intervened to prevent his success because a short war wouldn't provide sufficient entertainment or opportunities for divine meddling. This divine interference reveals the true nature of Greek prophetic curses. They weren't expressions of cosmic justice, but tools of cosmic politics. The gods used prophecies to manipulate mortals into taking actions that served divine purposes, regardless of the human cost. Consider how the gods manipulated Achilles throughout the war. Apollo guided the arrow that killed Patroclus, knowing that this loss would drive Achilles into a murderous rage that would entertain the gods with spectacular violence. The same Apollo later guided Paris's arrow to Achilles' heel, fulfilling the prophecy of the hero's death when his usefulness to the divine narrative was exhausted. The gods' treatment of prophecy reveals their fundamental contempt for mortal agency. They didn't just predict the future, they authored it, writing scripts that mortals were compelled to perform while believing they were making free choices. The tragedy wasn't just that mortals suffered, but that they suffered for the entertainment and political benefit of beings who viewed them as expendable. This divine manipulation extended beyond individual prophecies to encompass entire cycles of myth. The gods orchestrated the rise and fall of civilizations, the birth and death of heroes, and the creation and resolution of conflicts to serve their own narrative purposes. They were cosmic storytellers who demanded that their stories be written in blood. The psychological cruelty of this system cannot be overstated. Mortals were given just enough knowledge of their fate to suffer in anticipation of it, but never enough power to change it. They were made complicit in their own destruction by being given choices that felt meaningful but were actually predetermined. The God's use of prophecy as a tool of control reveals the ultimate horror of the Greek cosmos. It was a universe where the most powerful beings were also the most petty, cruel, and indifferent to mortal suffering. They possessed infinite power but finite wisdom, capable of orchestrating cosmic tragedies, but incapable of creating genuine justice or mercy. The genius of Greek prophetic curses lay not in their supernatural power, but in their psychological architecture. These weren't random predictions that happened to come true. They were carefully constructed traps that used human nature itself as the mechanism of their fulfillment. Every effective prophetic curse contained certain key elements that made it nearly impossible to avoid. First, the prophecy had to be specific enough to be recognizable when fulfilled, but vague enough to prevent effective countermeasures. Second, it had to exploit the recipient's strongest virtues and deepest fears, ensuring that their own character would drive them toward their doom. Finally, it had to create situations where the very act of trying to avoid the prophecy would actually cause it to happen. The prophecy of Oedipus demonstrates this structure perfectly. The prediction that he would kill his father and marry his mother was specific enough to be horrifying, but didn't include details about when, where, or how these events would occur. This lack of specificity meant that Oedipus couldn't take targeted action to prevent it. He could only make broad choices that actually moved him closer to his fate. The prophecy also exploited Oedipus's greatest virtues, his love for his adoptive parents and his desire to protect them from harm. These noble impulses drove him to leave Corinth, setting in motion the events that would lead to the fulfillment of the prophecy. If he had been selfish or cowardly, he might have stayed home and avoided his fate. But his heroic nature made him vulnerable to the prophetic trap. Most crucially, the prophecy created a self-fulfilling mechanism. By fleeing Corinth to avoid killing his father, Oedipus ensured that he would encounter his real father on the road to Thebes. By solving the Sphinx's riddle to save the city, he earned the right to marry the widowed queen, who was his mother. Every heroic act brought him closer to the horror he was trying to avoid. This pattern appears throughout Greek mythology. Cassandra's curse worked because her desperate attempts to warn people made her seem increasingly unstable and hysterical, undermining her credibility. The more urgently she tried to save people, the more convinced they became that she was mad. Her virtue, compassion for others, became the weapon used against her. The prophecy surrounding Achilles used a different but equally effective mechanism. By offering him a choice between long life and glorious death, the gods exploited his heroic nature and desire for eternal fame. They knew that someone with his character could only choose glory, but they presented it as free will to make the victim complicit in his own destruction. The psychological mechanics of these prophecies reveal sophisticated understanding of human behavior. The gods knew that people would act according to their nature when faced with crisis, and they crafted prophecies that turned virtues into vulnerabilities. Love became the cause of murder, wisdom led to blindness, courage resulted in doom, and compassion enabled tragedy, perhaps most insidiously. These prophecies often included elements that made the victim feel responsible for their own fate. Oedipus chose to leave Corinth, chose to fight at the crossroads, chose to solve the Sphinx's riddle, and chose to marry Jocasta. From his perspective, he was making free decisions based on the information available to him. The prophecy's power lay in ensuring that the free choices he made were actually the only choices his character would allow him to make. This illusion of agency was crucial to the prophecies. Psychological impact. If mortals were simply forced into their fates without any apparent choice, they might find comfort in the knowledge that they bore no responsibility. But by making them feel complicit in their own destruction, the prophecies added guilt and self-hatred to the already unbearable burden of tragic knowledge. The gods had discovered the perfect torture device, a trap that used the victim's own virtues as its mechanism, their own choices as its trigger, and their own conscience as its most painful component. In the Greek understanding of prophecy, knowledge of the future was never a gift, but always a burden. Unlike modern conceptions of prophecy as potentially helpful warnings, Greek prophetic knowledge was specifically designed to cause suffering without providing any genuine benefit to its recipients. The curse of prophetic knowledge worked on multiple psychological levels simultaneously. First, it created anticipatory anxiety. Once someone knew their fate, they couldn't unknow it. They would spend their remaining time consumed by dread, watching for signs that their doom was approaching, unable to enjoy whatever happiness they might have found in ignorance. Laius experienced this torture for years after learning that his son would kill him. Every day brought the possibility that the prophecy might begin to unfold. Every stranger could be the grown Oedipus returning to claim his destiny. Every political crisis might be the beginning of the end. The knowledge transformed his entire life into a prolonged death watch. Second, prophetic knowledge created impossible moral dilemmas. When Agamemnon learned that he must sacrifice Iphigenia to allow the Greek fleet to sail to Troy, he faced a choice between two forms of damnation: abandon his duty as a king and military leader, or murder his own daughter. The prophecy didn't provide guidance. It created a situation where any choice would destroy him morally and psychologically. These dilemmas were carefully constructed to have no correct answer. The gods ensured that every option available to the prophecy's recipient would lead to tragedy, making the knowledge a source of paralysis rather than empowerment. The victim couldn't act without causing harm, but couldn't refrain from acting without causing different harm. Third, prophetic knowledge isolated its recipients from normal human relationships. How do you maintain loving relationships when you know they're doomed to end in tragedy? How do you raise children when you've foreseen their deaths? How do you rule a kingdom when you know your decisions will lead to its destruction? Cassandra experienced this isolation most acutely. Her curse meant that she could never share the burden of her knowledge with others. She was trapped alone with visions of future horrors, unable to find comfort in companionship or support because no one believed her warnings. The knowledge that was supposed to make her special instead made her completely alone. The Greek conception of prophetic knowledge also revealed a fundamental truth about the relationship between information and power. In modern thinking, we often assume that more information leads to better outcomes, that knowledge is inherently empowering. But Greek mythology understood that knowledge without the power to act on it effectively is worse than ignorance. This principle appears throughout the myths. Oedipus's intelligence and investigative skills, the very qualities that made him a great king, became the instruments of his destruction when applied to uncovering his own identity. Cassandra's prophetic gift, which should have made her invaluable as an advisor, instead made her a figure of pity and fear. The gods understood that the most exquisite torture wasn't physical pain but psychological entrapment. By giving mortals just enough knowledge to understand their doom, but not enough power to prevent it, they created a form of suffering that was both inescapable and self-perpetuating. The victims of prophetic curses couldn't even find relief in death because their knowledge often extended beyond their own lifespans. Cassandra saw not only her own death, but the destruction of her entire city and people. Oedipus learned that his children would inherit the consequences of his actions, perpetuating the family's suffering into the next generation. This temporal extension of prophetic knowledge meant that death offered no escape from responsibility or guilt. The victims had to live with the knowledge that their actions would continue causing harm long after they were gone, that their very existence had set in motion chains of causation that would destroy people they loved. The oracle at Delphi wasn't just a religious institution. It was a sophisticated operation that manufactured fate through careful manipulation of information, expectation, and interpretation. Understanding how the oracle functioned reveals the mechanical aspects of prophetic curses and how they were systematically deployed to control individuals and entire civilizations. The oracle's power rested on several carefully maintained illusions. First was the illusion of divine communication, the Pythias trance states, induced by vapors rising from chasms in the earth and possibly enhanced by various substances, created a convincing performance of divine possession. Her incoherent utterances in this state were interpreted by temple priests, who claimed to be translating the god's words into human language. Modern archaeological investigation has revealed that the temple was indeed built over geological faults that released ethylene gas, which can produce euphoric and hallucinogenic effects. But this natural phenomenon was carefully exploited by the temple hierarchy to create the appearance of supernatural communication. The priests understood that the Pythia's altered state would make her utterances seem otherworldly while actually being influenced by their prior briefings and suggestions. The second illusion was that of prophetic accuracy. The oracle's reputation for correct predictions was maintained through several techniques that had nothing to do with supernatural insight. The temple maintained extensive networks of informants throughout the Greek world, gathering intelligence about political situations, family disputes, military plans, and personal secrets that could inform their prophecies. When someone came seeking advice about whether to wage war, the oracle's priests already knew about troop movements, alliance negotiations, and resource limitations that would affect the outcome. They could craft prophecies that seemed prescient, but were actually based on superior information, gathering, and analysis. The priests also perfected the art of ambiguous language that could be interpreted as accurate regardless of how events unfolded. The prophecy to Croesus about destroying a great army if he crossed the river was a masterpiece of this technique. Whether he won or lost the battle, the prophecy could be claimed as fulfilled. The third illusion was that of divine impartiality. People believed that the oracle served the god's will rather than human political interests. But the reality was far more complex. The temple received enormous wealth from its consultations, making it economically dependent on maintaining its reputation and influence. More importantly, it became a tool for managing conflicts between Greek city-states and influencing major political decisions. The oracle's prophecies often served to prevent wars by providing face-saving ways for aggressive rulers to back down from conflicts they were likely to lose. By claiming divine disapproval of a planned campaign, a king could avoid a potentially disastrous military adventure without appearing weak or cowardly. In this sense, the oracles served a genuine political function, but one that had nothing to do with supernatural foresight. The institutional structure of the oracle created a self-perpetuating system of belief and dependence. People who received prophecies that seemed to come true became advocates for the oracle's power, spreading stories that enhanced its reputation. Those whose prophecies appeared to fail could be convinced that they had misinterpreted the god's message, preserving the institution's credibility. The oracle also benefited from the psychological phenomenon of confirmation bias. People naturally noticed events that seemed to confirm their prophecies, while ignoring or forgetting contradictory evidence. A prophecy warning of danger would be remembered if anything bad happened, but forgotten if life proceeded normally. The priests understood these psychological tendencies and crafted prophecies to take advantage of them. They would predict common events that were likely to occur anyway, frame their predictions in ways that multiple outcomes could fulfill them, and use language that encouraged people to interpret ordinary events as prophetically significant. Business model of the oracle reveals how prophetic curses functioned as tools of social control. By convincing people that their fates were predetermined and discoverable through divine consultation, the institution created a population that was psychologically dependent on external validation for major decisions. This dependence served the interests of both the oracle and the broader power structures of Greek society. Citizens who believed their lives were governed by divine will were less likely to challenge political authorities or attempt to change social conditions through their own actions. The oracle provided a safety valve for social tensions by channeling people's anxieties about the future into religious rather than political activities. The most insidious aspect of the oracle's operation was how it convinced people to participate in their own manipulation. Clients would pay substantial fees for the privilege of receiving prophecies that would then constrain their choices and actions. They would leave feeling grateful for knowledge that actually made their lives more difficult and constrained, while most Greek mythological figures were trapped by prophetic curses. A few characters attempted to challenge or subvert the system of fate. Their stories reveal both the rigid nature of prophetic determinism and the rare circumstances under which it might be questioned or even occasionally overcome. Prometheus represents, perhaps, the most direct challenge to divine authority over fate and knowledge. This titan didn't just rebel against Zeus. He specifically challenged the god's control over information and destiny. By stealing fire and giving it to humanity, Prometheus was essentially providing mortals with tools that could potentially alter their fates. The fire Prometheus stole wasn't just literal flame, but symbolic of all knowledge and technology that could improve human conditions. This gift represented a direct threat to the god's system of prophetic control because it gave mortals power to change their circumstances rather than simply accepting them as divinely ordained. Zeus's punishment of Prometheus was specifically designed to deter others from similar challenges to divine authority. Chained to a rock where an eagle would devour his liver daily, only to have it regenerate each night. Prometheus experienced eternal torture that served as a warning about the consequences of defying prophetic fate. But Prometheus's rebellion planted seeds of change in the cosmic order. His gift of fire began a process of human development that would eventually challenge the gods' dominance. The knowledge and technology that flowed from his gift gave mortals increasing power to shape their own destinies, gradually eroding the absolute nature of prophetic control. Orpheus attempted a different kind of challenge to fate through his journey to the underworld to retrieve his wife, Eurydice. When she died from a snake bite, Orpheus refused to accept this as an unchangeable fate. Instead, he used his musical gifts to charm his way into Hades and convince the rulers of the dead to release her. Initially, Orpheus succeeded where others had failed. His music moved even the hearts of Hades and Persephone, who agreed to release Eurydice on one condition. Orpheus must not look back at her until they both reached the upper world. This condition seemed simple enough, but it was actually a sophisticated prophetic trap. The prohibition against looking back exploited Orpheus's greatest strength, his love for Eurydice, turning it against him. As they climbed toward the light, his anxiety about her presence behind him grew unbearable. Just before reaching the surface, driven by love and doubt, he turned to ensure she was still following him. In that moment, she vanished back into the underworld, lost forever. Orpheus's story reveals that even successful challenges to fate can be undermined by the very emotions and virtues that motivated them. The gods allowed him to come close to victory, then engineered his failure through his own character traits. His attempt to save Eurydice became another example of how prophetic systems use human nature against itself. A more subtle challenge to prophetic fate appears in the story of Odysseus, whose defining characteristic was metis, cunning intelligence, that could sometimes outmaneuver divine will. Throughout his long journey home from Troy, Odysseus faced numerous prophecies and divine commands, but he often found ways to technically fulfill them while subverting their intent. When the sirens sang to lure him to his death, Odysseus didn't resist their call as other heroes might have done. Instead, he had his crew tie him to the mast and plug their own ears with wax, allowing him to hear the sirens' song safely. He satisfied his curiosity about their prophecies and knowledge without falling victim to their trap. This approach, technical compliance that subverted divine intent, became Odysseus's signature method for dealing with prophetic challenges. He would find loopholes in fate's pronouncements, ways to honor the letter of prophecies while violating their spirit. His success suggested that truly clever mortals might sometimes outmaneuver the gods' plans. However, even Odysseus's victories came at enormous cost. His 10-year journey home, filled with supernatural obstacles and divine persecution, demonstrated that challenging fate, even successfully, brought its own forms of suffering. His cleverness saved his life, but couldn't prevent the deaths of all his companions or the chaos that consumed his household. During his absence, the most interesting challenge to prophetic fate came from an unexpected source: the evolution of Greek thought itself. As Greek civilization developed more sophisticated philosophical and political concepts, some thinkers began questioning the absolute nature of divine will and prophetic determinism. The playwright Aeschylus, in his trilogy The Orestia, explored the possibility that cycles of prophetic violence could be broken through the development of legal institutions and rational justice. His work suggested that human civilization could evolve beyond the primitive system of fate and revenge that characterized earlier mythological thinking. Similarly, philosophers like Socrates began questioning the authority of traditional oracles. and Prophecies, arguing that true wisdom came from acknowledging the limits of human knowledge rather than claiming divine insight. This philosophical skepticism gradually undermined the psychological foundations of prophetic belief. These challenges to prophetic fate, while often unsuccessful for the individuals who attempted them, planted seeds of change that would eventually transform Greek culture. They suggested that the system of divine control through prophecy was not eternal or unchangeable, but could be questioned, resisted, and potentially overcome through human development and wisdom. The true horror of Greek prophetic curses lay not in their supernatural elements, but in their sophisticated understanding of human psychology. These myths reveal an almost modern comprehension of how anxiety, guilt, and helplessness can be weaponized to create lasting psychological damage. Consider the mental state of someone who has received a prophetic curse. They wake each day knowing that specific terrible events await them, but not knowing when these events will occur. This uncertainty creates a constant state of hypervigilance, where every interaction, every decision, every random occurrence might be the beginning of their prophesied doom. This psychological condition resembles what modern psychology recognizes as anticipatory anxiety disorder, but with a crucial difference: the threatened event is guaranteed to occur. Normal anxiety can be managed through various coping strategies, including the possibility that feared outcomes might not happen. But prophetic anxiety offers no such escape because the future is fixed and knowable. The myths demonstrate sophisticated understanding of how this kind of certainty about negative future events affects decision-making and behavior. People under prophetic curses often exhibit what we might now call hypervigilance and avoidance behaviors. They become obsessed with trying to prevent their fates, interpreting ordinary events as potentially prophetic signs and isolating themselves from relationships that might trigger the predicted outcomes. Laius's behavior after receiving his prophecy illustrates this psychological pattern perfectly. He became unable to have normal, intimate relationships with his wife, transforming their marriage from a source of joy into a source of terror. Every moment of closeness carried the risk of conception, which would bring him closer to his prophesied death. The prophecies also exploited what modern psychology recognizes as cognitive biases, the availability heuristic, which makes vivid, memorable information seem more likely than it actually is, worked in favor of prophetic belief. Once someone had heard their specific fate described in dramatic detail, that scenario would dominate their thinking about the future, making it seem inevitable even when other outcomes were possible. Confirmation bias, the tendency to notice evidence that supports existing beliefs while ignoring contradictory evidence, helped maintain belief in prophetic accuracy. Someone expecting to fulfill a curse would notice events that seemed to move them toward that fate, while dismissing signs that suggested other possibilities. The Greek understanding of prophetic psychology also recognized the phenomenon we now call learned helplessness. When people believe they have no control over important outcomes in their lives, they often stop trying to exert any control at all, even in situations where they actually do have options. This learned helplessness appears throughout the myths. Characters who receive prophecies often become passive, accepting terrible events as inevitable rather than fighting against them. Cassandra's behavior exemplifies this pattern. After years of having her warnings ignored, she eventually stopped trying to save people, resigned to watching disasters unfold. The myths also demonstrate understanding of how trauma and prophecy can create dissociative states. Characters like Cassandra and the Pythia are often described as being beside themselves, or not themselves when experiencing prophetic visions. This psychological splitting allowed them to function in daily life while carrying unbearable knowledge about future tragedies. Perhaps most insidiously, the prophetic curses created what we might now recognize as cognitive distortions around personal responsibility and control. Victims of prophecies often experienced simultaneous feelings of total helplessness and complete responsibility for their fates. They felt powerless to change their destinies, but guilty for every action that seemed to move them toward fulfillment of their curses. This psychological double bind appears clearly in Oedipus's story. He felt completely responsible for his father's death and his marriage to his mother, despite having been manipulated by circumstances beyond his knowledge or control. The prophecy had created conditions where he would inevitably feel guilty for outcomes he couldn't have prevented. The God's use of prophecy reveals sophisticated understanding of how to create maximum psychological suffering through the manipulation of hope and despair. They would often include elements in their prophecies that seemed to offer escape routes or alternative outcomes, giving victims just enough hope to keep struggling against their fates. This cruel manipulation of hope appears in Achilles' prophecy, which offered him a choice between long life and glorious death. The appearance of choice made his eventual death more psychologically devastating because he could tell himself he had chosen it, even though his character made any other choice impossible. The prophetic curses also exploited social psychology, understanding how isolation and stigma could amplify individual suffering. Characters who received prophecies often found themselves unable to maintain normal social relationships because others either didn't believe their knowledge or were frightened by its implications. The psychological insights embedded in Greek prophetic myths have influenced human understanding of fate, destiny, and free will for over 2 millennia. These ancient stories continue to shape how we think about the relationship between knowledge and power, the nature of personal responsibility, and the psychological cost of trying to control the future. The concept of the self-fulfilling prophecy, first articulated by sociologist Robert K. Merton in 1948, draws directly from Greek mythological understanding of how predictions can create the conditions for their own fulfillment. Merton's work demonstrated that beliefs about the future, even when initially false, can become true through the actions they inspire. This principle appears throughout modern psychology and sociology. Students who are told they are likely to fail often do fail, not because the prediction was accurate, but because the expectation affected their motivation and effort. Economic panics can be triggered by predictions of economic disaster, as people's fear-driven behavior creates the very conditions the prediction described. The Greek understanding of prophetic psychology has also influenced modern therapeutic approaches to anxiety and depression. Cognitive behavioral therapy recognizes that catastrophic thinking about the future can create present suffering and lead to behaviors that make negative outcomes more likely. The therapeutic process often involves helping clients recognize how their predictions about the future affect their current choices and experiences. The myth's insights about the relationship between knowledge and suffering appear in contemporary debates about genetic testing, medical prognosis, and predictive analytics. The question of whether people benefit from knowing about future risks they cannot prevent echoes the Greek understanding that prophetic knowledge often increases suffering without providing meaningful agency. Modern bioethics grapples with questions that the Greeks explored through their myths. Should people be told about genetic predispositions to untreatable diseases? How much should patients know about terminal diagnoses? When does knowledge about the future become a burden rather than a benefit? These contemporary dilemmas reflect the same fundamental tension between knowing and acting that characterize Greek prophetic curses. The influence of Greek prophetic psychology extends into literature, film, and popular culture. The concept of tragic heroes whose greatest strengths become their fatal weaknesses draws directly from mythological templates established in stories like those of Oedipus and Achilles. Modern storytelling continues to explore how knowledge, virtue, and fate interact to create compelling narratives about human limitation and divine justice. The noir genre, in particular, owes a debt to Greek prophetic myths. The classic noir protagonist, like Oedipus, investigates a mystery only to discover that he is implicated in the very crime he's trying to solve. The genre's signature mood of fatalistic pessimism reflects the Greek understanding that human agency is often illusory and that knowledge frequently leads to destruction rather than salvation. Contemporary horror often employs prophetic elements that echo Greek mythological patterns. Characters receive warnings about future dangers, but find that their attempts to avoid these dangers actually cause them to occur. The Final Destination film franchise explicitly explores this theme, showing how death finds ways to claim victims, even when they try to escape their fates. The Greek insights about prophetic manipulation have found expression in modern political and social analysis. The concept of manufactured consent, developed by political theorists like Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky, describes how powerful institutions create the appearance of public choice, while actually constraining options in ways that serve elite interests. This process mirrors how the oracle at Delphi created the illusion of divine guidance while actually serving political and economic functions. Modern understanding of propaganda and psychological manipulation draws heavily from Greek insights about how authority figures can use apparent wisdom and foresight to control behavior. The myth's depiction of how the oracle exploited people's desire for certainty about the future parallels contemporary analysis of how political and religious leaders use promises and predictions to maintain power. The therapeutic implications of Greek prophetic psychology continue to evolve. Modern trauma therapy recognizes that people who have experienced severe abuse or violence often develop hypervigilance and catastrophic thinking patterns that resemble the psychological states of mythological characters under prophetic curses. Understanding how these patterns develop and persist helps therapists develop more effective interventions. The myths also influenced modern philosophical thinking about determinism and free will. Existentialist philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus grappled with questions about human agency and cosmic meaninglessness that echo themes from Greek tragedy. Their work explores how people can create meaning and maintain dignity even when faced with apparently meaningless suffering and cosmic indifference. As we reach the end of our journey through the dark landscape of Greek prophetic curses, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. These ancient stories weren't just entertainment or primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena. They were sophisticated psychological documents that revealed uncomfortable truths about human nature, divine power, and the relationship between knowledge and suffering. The Greeks understood something that modern optimism often obscures. Sometimes, knowing the future is worse than ignorance. Sometimes our greatest strengths become our fatal weaknesses. And sometimes the very act of trying to escape our fate ensures that we fulfill it. Their myths created a cosmos where the gods were not benevolent guides but cosmic puppeteers who found entertainment in mortal suffering. These weren't stories about justice or moral instruction. They were explorations of helplessness, investigations into how power structures use knowledge as a weapon, and demonstrations of how even the most heroic qualities can be turned against their possessors. The prophetic curses served as metaphors for all the ways that life can trap us using our own virtues, our own loves, our own desperate attempts to do the right thing. The oracle at Delphi, with its motto, "Know thyself," offered the cruelest joke in ancient religion. It promised self-knowledge while delivering self-destruction, wisdom while providing torment, divine guidance while serving human manipulation. The institution revealed how authority figures throughout history have used apparent supernatural insight to control and exploit those who seek certainty in an uncertain world. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of these myths is their continued relevance. We live in an age of unprecedented access to information about the future, from genetic testing that reveals disease predispositions to climate models that predict environmental catastrophe. Like the ancient Greeks, we're discovering that knowledge of negative future outcomes doesn't necessarily provide the power to prevent them, and that knowing our fate can be its own form of curse. The myths remind us that human beings have always struggled with the tension between agency and fate, between the desire to know the future and the psychological cost of that knowledge. They suggest that some forms of wisdom come at prices too high to pay, and that the relationship between knowledge and power is far more complex than simple equations would suggest. In our contemporary world, where algorithms predict our behavior, data mining reveals our patterns, and various forms of prophecy masquerade as science or wisdom, the Greek understanding of prophetic manipulation remains urgently relevant. The myths warn us to be suspicious of those who claim to know our futures, especially when that knowledge comes with strings attached. The eternal curse of prophecy isn't supernatural, it's psychological. It's the recognition that complete knowledge of the future would be unbearable, that uncertainty is the price we pay for hope, and that sometimes ignorance truly is bliss. The Greeks gave us stories that revealed these truths with brutal clarity, creating myths that continue to haunt us because they touch on fears and truths that transcend historical periods. Their prophetic curses weren't just ancient superstitions, but sophisticated explorations of how prediction, manipulation, and psychology intersect to create suffering. They remain relevant not because we believe in oracles and divine prophecy, but because we continue to struggle with the fundamental questions they raised about knowledge, power, fate, and the human condition. Tonight, as you close your eyes and drift towards sleep, remember that the Greeks would have considered you blessed in your ignorance of tomorrow's events. They understood that not knowing your fate might be the greatest gift the cosmos can provide, and that sometimes the most merciful gods are those who remain silent about the future. In the end, the Greek prophetic curses teach us that some knowledge is too dangerous to possess, some truths too terrible to bear, and some forms of wisdom indistinguishable from forms of torment. They remind us that in the relationship between mortals and fate, victory often looks suspiciously like defeat, and salvation can be the cruelest curse of all. Sweet dreams, and may your future remain mercifully hidden from your sight.